Good morning. This is one of the series between myself and Slidell magazine where we're trying to bring some relief to ourselves as well as hopefully you as you hear these stories. I've written them over the past 5 or 6 years exclusively for Slidell magazine. I'm a writer, not a reader. So if I skip some words or have to repeat or even have to repeat a whole sentence, just remember, this is not rehearsed, and we're doing it for both of our enjoyments. Slidell Magazine's Ken Vermanis and John Case. Now the story I'm about to read you is entitled The Company Store. It reverts back to one of the historical pieces, which was why I was contracted to write for Slidell Magazine in the very beginning. That soon evolved into short stories that do not have any historical basis, but this is a historically based short story. In fact, it's totally nonfiction. The Company Store. There are times when a story is not a story. At least it is not one that will have lots of twists and turns with surprising endings and a complicated plot. Sometimes a story is best told with just basic facts. This is such a story. Tennessee Ernie Ford said in a song, "I sold my soul to the company store." This was a factual statement for many people around the turn of the century, but not so true for those who worked for Salmon Brick and Lumber Company of Slidell, Louisiana. In the mid-1880s, Slidell was just a little village, and only a village because of the railroad. The railroad, constructed a few years prior, had created demand for labor and creosoted timbers for the assembly of the train trestle crossing Lake Pontchartrain. The citizens that arrived were hard-working, but maybe boisterous and downright rowdy at times. They lived in small houses, some in boarding houses, and many recreated at a number of saloons that were scattered along what is now Front Street. Into this community, an ambitious man named Fritz Salmon arrived in about 1885. A 1920-era interview states that he came with one colored man and a mule. He came from the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, where he had honed his entrepreneurial skills as taught to him by his relatives. He found the clay of this region to be of high quality, and he soon began manufacturing bricks that were not only sold locally, but sold across the lake in New Orleans. He acquired a large tract of land from the Guzman family and expanding the brick-making efforts into the harvesting of trees and the processing of timber. His company was known as Slidell Brick and Lumber. The growth and success of this business were phenomenal, and he would soon employ 800 Slidellians. The company store, or commissary, was not a novel idea to Fritz Salmon. Most large companies owned one, and their motives for owning one were varied. In those days, most people were paid in scrip or brozine. Scrip was paper money, and brozine was a coin made out of cheap metal, usually brass, or even sometimes wood. Both were printed or made specifically for that company and usually had the company's logo on them. In most cases, they could only be exchanged for goods at the company store or between fellow employees. The purpose of a commissary could be for various reasons. It could be to create another profit center for the company. In some cases, the commissary's prices were not competitive and the company price gouged their employees. The company could virtually recoup most of the money that was paid in wages. On the other hand, it could have been a place where the company owner wanted to take care of his employees and give them a real price break, much as a cooperative. One final reason, and one that is most interesting, was that by paying with scrip and having a commissary that did not sell alcohol, the employer was assured of having a sober workforce that would show up when expected. Mr. Salmon, who later brought brothers Albert and Jacob into the business, was well liked by his employees, so it is unlikely that he did not provide a fair commissary. Records indicate that unions failed to organize because of the loyalty his employees had toward him and his company. Interviews at the time revealed that he had an open door policy for any employee that wished to talk directly to him. He was referred to affectionately as the old man. So maybe his employees did not owe their soul, but it was not uncommon for credit to be extended to them by Mr. Salmon. Just prior to World War I, the Salmon brothers expanded their operation into a shipyard that provided ships for the war effort and those operations that supported it. Other ventures were in Mexico, Costa Rica, and other Central American countries. All were run out of the offices in Slidell and later New Orleans, and the commissary was the central nervous system of this business. Before the acquisition of the shipyard, and not long after he went into business, Mr. Salmon built the commissary that today stands at the corner of Cleveland Avenue and Front Street. The best that can be asserted is that it was constructed a handsome building about 1890. Almost anything could be bought there, and it employed about 20 clerks. Longtime Slidell resident Wesley Carroll remembered buying his first pair of high-top shoes there to go possum hunting. In the late 1920s and early 30s, it was still being operated as a store that sold almost anything. By that time, the use of script and brosine had passed, however. Unfortunately, I have not been able to acquire even a picture of what that currency looked like. Mr. Carroll related that there was only one cashier in the store. You gave your money to the clerk placed it in a carrier that was on a little trolley. The trolley was then pulled upstairs. The money was taken and the change and receipt returned to the patron. The practice remained in place in many stores until the mid-1950s. By that time, the Salmon Commissary was a thing of the past. In the 1940s, part of it was converted into a movie theater called the Deluxe. This had followed a previous theater in town called the Arcade. The theaters were given nicknames, the Old Show and the New Show. The Arcade installed double-wide seats, not for romantic closeness, but to accommodate some of the very overweight customers that enjoyed the movies. A review of old Slidell newspaper shows headlines saying, "Clark Gable in town for 3 days." This, of course, only meant that he was starring in a movie that was playing at one of the theaters. He was not actually in town in person. The building has gone through some occupancy changes and physical changes over the years. Homer Pritchard Jr., great nephew of Mr. Salmon, remembers there was a basement in the building that's no longer there. It is likely that it was destroyed when the floor was sloped for the theater in the 1960s. The building housed Harold's Auto Parts and a teenage nightclub called the Purple Pickle. The Purple Pickle, owned by Tommy Siaka and Bill Succo, was very much ahead of its time for a teen venue and bringing high-end musicians to Slidell. Some of the stars that performed right here in Slidell were Steppenwolf, Van Morrison, and the Count 5 Band. John Fred and the Playboy Band was a regular, and Sam and Dave were also making appearances. In fitting with the times, there were go-go dancers in cages. The house band, usually called the Rebels, later changed their name to the Five. It consisted of Johnny Johnson, later band director at Slidell High, Bobby Fashon, Larry Psycho, Bill Succo, and the well-known Curtis Arsenault, also known as Coco Robichaux. Others that played in the band from time to time included Bob Lee, a saxophone, and the musically successful Richard Monegro. Curtis Arsenault was also in charge of the psychedelic decor. Bob Rispoli, who was manager of the Purple Pickle, remembers that the famous bands that performed there were not famous at the time, and the Purple Pickle was just another stop on their tours as they tried to build notoriety. He also remembers that the teenage patrons, by and large, respected authority and did not use drugs. He recalls that as time passed, the traveling bands would demand a private room for breaks. It soon became apparent that rooms were being used by the bands for drugs. This was kind of the end of innocence in Slidell and a sign of things to come. Social cliques were not uncommon at the time. There were the Cats and the Frats. The Cats, dressed in dark clothes, sometimes leather, had long combed hair, and could best be described as having that James Dean look. The Frats were described as having the more hippie type. Occasionally, these groups opposed each other, but Bob Rispoli does not remember any major incidents. In 1969, the building was purchased by the Ricca family and has been a multi-purpose building ever since. There have been a number of occupants, including Marie Ricca's All in the Frame, Visions Photography, Trivent Financial, as well as residential apartments. We hope that the oldest commercial building in Slidell has a long future as a landmark in our city. Thank you, Marie, for preserving this bit of our history. In addition to those mentioned, thanks to Marie, Buddy Pichon, Gary Dupleshain, Larry Psycho, and John Lamarck for their remembrances of the commissary.